Chapter 2. Lorena. Here and now. Not even the jab of an elbow delivered to her ribs by way of some careless reveller lurching past was enough to wake Lorena. She was simply too stupefied for the blow to rouse her, though she'd later wonder where she'd got the bruise. Rather, it was the cascade of foaming drink that spilled down the back of her neck and across her tattooed shoulders that yanked her out of a blissfully dreamless sleep and back to the waking world. As her eyes snapped open, Lorena had just enough time to deliver a lingering, vindictive glare at the pirate who'd splashed her before the first waves of recollection and nausea hit her in tandem. Her cheek, she realized with dismay, was stuck to the surface of the pockmarked bench by whatever puddle she'd collapsed into face first the night before. It smelled like grog. She really hoped it was. Carefully separating her head from the coarse wood that had served as her pillow for the night, Lorena began to run down the familiar mental checklist she used after any particularly heavy bout of celebrating. It had been a celebration. She was sure of that much, even though the details swam at the edges of her memory, like silvery, slippery minnows refusing to be hooked. Arms and legs, all present and correct, which was good. Lorena didn't consider herself the slightest bit vain, but she was particularly fond of the ink on her right forearm, so losing that would be a shame. Her brown leather clothes were likewise intact, if unpleasantly soggy. Still, they'd dry. What about her purse? That, she discovered almost immediately, was now little more than a sad tatter of cloth at her side, the lower seam slashed expertly, and its contents doubtlessly drunk or gambled by now. While annoying, this was hardly unexpected given the disreputable company all around her. All of them pirates, men and women alike, a heady mix of different tongues filling the air as they took in beer for breakfast. Curling her toes, Lorena felt around until she located the reassuring weight of her last gold piece, the one she kept in her left boot for emergencies. It could stay where it was for now, she decided, at least while there was still the chance of a free meal somewhere out there. Bracing herself to stand, she cast a disapproving look around the tavern. That was when she remembered the map. It was stuck to the bench in front of her with a knife she'd borrowed from a passing pirate's belt the night before, though its importance was another detail that had been washed away by the events of the evening. Removing the dagger, she turned the parchment over in her fingertips, eager for any clue that might remind her of why she'd been so intent on keeping it close at hand. It was then she realized there were words on the back, though drink had smudged the writing and she could only make out 3 words with any certainty. Seek Athena's fortune. Not helpful, Lorena decided. Infuriatingly vague as secret messages went, in fact, not to mention irrelevant, as all she intended to seek right now was something to fill the grumbling hole in her belly. Crumpling up the map and pitching it expertly into the embers of the large fireplace behind her, she stood at last, stretching her arms above her head to excise the knots from her back as she yawned loudly. A smaller woman, lingering in the doorway, wisely made way as she approached, for Lorena was an imposing figure, even when she didn't mean to be. Tall and wiry, with olive skin and chestnut hair set into a tight ponytail, Lorena moved with the continual tension of a coiled spring. She had long ago learned to make good use of her height and ferocity when dealing with those around her, and if that wasn't enough, well, the spring could be made to uncoil with a swiftness that few pirates forgot in a hurry. Striding into the sunlight, Lorena basked in the salty air for a moment, before her head moved in a slow arc, drinking in the unfamiliar surroundings. There was patchy grass the colour of fresh limes beneath the soles of her boots, though it gave way to a spider web of dirt paths that ran between ramshackle buildings, the tavern, a few storage sheds, and what seemed to be small shops that Lorena decided she'd investigate later. The largest pathway zigzagged down the hill toward a network of wooden boards that extended out into the water on stout poles. These boardwalks comprised a busy dock that bustled with crews and traders, shipwrights and swabbies, rubbing shoulders as they went about their business. A clucking chicken pecked hopefully around her as she stood watching two burly pirates. They staggered down a sun-bleached staircase and off toward the dock, arm in arm, still singing. She shook her head, bemused. It was almost funny how closely this place resembled old tales about the Sea of... That was why she'd been celebrating. She'd made it to the Sea of Thieves. Realizing she was grinning like an idiot, Lorena took a deep breath and outwardly composed herself, though her heart was still pounding. Every pirate capable of weighing anchor had heard about the Sea of Thieves, but few were bold enough to consider the crossing, let alone actually attempt it. But she'd made it through, against all odds. Even better, her traveling companions had never suspected a thing. She sniffed once, then twice. A tantalizing aroma had wrapped itself around her as she stood in thought, and now her nose temporarily took control of her legs so that it could lead her to the source. It was the unmistakable scent of bacon, and it was coming from the private quarters at the rear of the tavern, suggesting the bacon currently belonged to somebody. But that wouldn't be a problem for long. Poking her head into the tiny kitchen, Lorena spotted the tavern's barkeeper, a whiskered, red-nosed mountain of a man. His name was lost in the haze of last night's carousing, but that didn't matter. What did matter was the contents of his frying pan, which was sizzling plump sausages and fatty rashers of pork. He whistled cheerily as he worked on the beguiling breakfast, and it was only as he turned to dispose of two large eggshells that he spotted Lorena's shadow cast across the floor, and bade her hello by way of a hearty wink. "Well now, I'm glad to see you're awake. Your snoring was disturbing the spiders." "I don't..." Lorena began hotly, and then remembered the bacon. That is, I don't suppose food comes included at your very fine establishment?" "Bed and breakfast, aye. For them's that remembers to pay for a bed," the barkeeper replied agreeably. Lorena opened her mouth to protest this inequitable treatment, but her stomach got there first, emitting a protesting growl that echoed embarrassingly around the room, and drew a hearty chuckle from the ruddy-cheeked man. "We've got some eggs that needs eating up today, though, and only empty rooms upstairs." He paused and looked Lorena up and down, curiosity twinkling in his eyes as he assessed her. "It's rare to find a new arrival who doesn't have a crew to call her own. You've got to be very brave or lucky to make it here by yourself." Lorena arched an eyebrow. Was this a negotiation? "That's a long and very interesting tale," she replied, cautiously, inviting herself fully into the kitchen to take a seat upon a slightly wobbly stool. "The sort that would amuse your customers for months, I'm sure. Unfortunately, I'm so hungry, I'll probably keel over halfway through telling it." The barkeeper scratched his bristled cheek for a moment, then nodded. "Fair is fair. A good meal in exchange for a good story." He bustled through the cupboards momentarily until he located a second plate, chipped and rather faded, and while Lorena's eyes roved eagerly over the contents of the sizzling pan, she began to weave her tale for the barkeep. Her first memory was the sting of a smacked bottom after she returned from the woods that wrapped around her hometown like a highwayman's cloak. The forest was a dark, tangled, stinging, bramble-filled labyrinth that her mother had repeatedly forbidden her to enter. Naturally, this made it the most enticing place in the world. As she'd grown older, the thrills she felt from stepping into the unknown had only become stronger. If there was a beaten path, Lorena would stray from it. When she was presented with a map, she'd immediately head for the edge because there was nothing more boring than following someone else's footsteps. How would anything new get done if everyone was just walking in circles? It was a life of fierce independence, and it had taught Lorena many things. How to wield a homemade bow, firstly, then later a rusty sword that she spotted while diving for crabs one day. She learned how to fasten a splint, how to sleep in a tree, which mushrooms were safe to eat, and how to run very quickly away from wild boar tracks when she saw them. She signed on as a deckhand because she'd finally exhausted every nook and cranny of the island she called home. Not that it felt like much of a home anymore, with Mum in the ground and Dad in the tavern more often than not. She worked hard and listened even harder, and soon she knew as much as anyone about a life at sea. She could furl a sail, swing from a rope, and use a pistol when necessary. She scrimped and saved to buy a tiny sloop of her own, because while she understood the usefulness of a crew, she quickly tired of sailing only where the captain's orders dictated they go. Traveling from port to port was fine while you're learning the basics, but there were no adventures to be had at those sorts of places, save for the occasional giggling rendezvous. These were almost always followed by flight ahead of the morning sun. Fun enough, but never a reason to stay. Despite her misdemeanors, Lorena had never given much thought to piracy, but she'd been branded one just the same. A brief exploration into some caves she presumed were unoccupied had brought her into the heart of a smuggling operation, being conducted by the local governor, who wasted no time in bringing her likeness to the attention of the authorities. At first she fought to clear her name, but then she remembered an old saying of her father's: "It was better to be hung as a wolf than as a lamb." From that day onward, Lorena embraced the epithet of pirate. She would indulge herself in acts of larceny and vandalism from time to time, particularly if she spotted one of the governor's ships on the horizon. His goods always fetched a pretty penny. This had all been fine for a while, but little by little, the world was getting smaller. It was more crowded, too. Once untamed islands were becoming homesteads, safe havens were hard to come by, and many proud pirates had given up their galleons for a life on land. The navy was everywhere, pitiless in pursuit of people who just wanted to peek and prod underneath what few stones remained unturned. Lorena had been clambering across the rocky shoreline of a deserted cove when she'd spotted the bottle gleaming in the sunlight. To her amusement, there was an actual message inside, and she spent the afternoon carefully extracting the cork. To simply smash her way inside had seemed wrong somehow, though she couldn't fathom why. Thanks to the map that had been safely sealed away through the bottle's long journey, she read the term Sea of Thieves for the first time and grew determined to learn what it might mean. They, Lorena told the barkeeper, meant the grizzled old salt she'd been drinking under the table in some game or other, said there was no law on those strange seas. They spoke of lost civilization sprawled across the bottom of the sea, of ancient cave drawings pointing the way to hidden treasures that could transform a person, body and soul. Above all, they spoke of entire regions that barely had a name, let alone charts that pinned everything down and drained the life out of the world. For Lorena, the Sea of Thieves represented a solution to her wanderlust, and yet it might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. As she was a lone wolf, more concerned with exploration than extortion, her name and face were relatively unknown, her talents unproven. She would be captain to nobody, bar a crew of novices, the sort whose inexperience would see them sunk before they were 2 days out of harbor. In desperation, she'd taken to roaming every port in search of an open position on a ship that might be heading for the Sea of Thieves. But despite the map in her hand, many captains called her a gullible fool for believing such a place might even exist, and all denied her passage. Finally, having eavesdropped on a pair of pirates whose tongues had been loosened all too easily by the contents of their glasses, Lorena followed them back to their vessel and accosted its captain, a squat merchant dripping with rings and gemstones, who'd used his considerable influence to secure a map that matched Lorena's own. He stoutly refused her a position on his crew, and while he grudgingly offered a position as a passenger, the price, even if she traded away her trusty sloop, was far beyond what she could afford. Frustrated and unwanted, she stormed out of the captain's cabin and was almost to the gangplank when she spotted a stack of barrels being lowered, one by one, into the hold. It was the work of a moment to tip several hundred pickled onions into the water below, though she began to regret her choice of hiding place the minute she'd sealed the lid back over her head. The smell was almost overwhelming. After 10 minutes of waiting on the dock, crouched in a vinegar-soaked cask with her eyes and lungs stinging, she was about ready to give up. Suddenly, Lorena found herself slung over a brawny deckhand's shoulder and thrown down unceremoniously atop a cargo pile, left to bounce around in the pitch-black mustiness, at which point a bad smell became the least of her problems, as she now had to keep herself hidden for the duration of the voyage. The barkeeper laughed so heartily at this part that he began to choke on his bacon, and Lorena had to thump him on the back until he calmed down. Only when she felt the gentle bobbing of the port's waters give way to the rougher waves of the open sea did Lorena dare to explode from her barrel, gasping into the comparative bliss of the ship's damp lower decks. She spent the next 3 days lurking out of sight, behind a dwindling cargo pile, barely daring to sleep, and holding her breath whenever the crew approached to take more rations upstairs, desperate not to make so much as a squeak. She dared to sneak morsels of food and drink only when the ship's crew was eating, so that their commotion covered hers. On one particularly windy night, she came within seconds of being discovered as a pair of ham-sized hands reached for the crate she was crouching inside. Luckily, the ship struck a sandbar with a particularly violent lurch that sent everyone stumbling and slid the box clean across the room, giving her a chance to scramble to safety in the confusion. Another evening, she was pinned, furious and immobile, beneath a pile of sacks and a stupefied sailor who'd unwittingly passed out on top of her hiding place. The indignities continued to pile up, one after another, and Lorena had increasingly frequent daydreams about storming up above deck and simply seizing the vessel single-handedly. Finally, there was a raucous cheer from overhead, and she guessed that the ship had made it through to the Sea of Thieves. To her surprise and delight, she felt the ship weigh anchor shortly after with an unmistakable clatter, then heard the crew disembarking, chattering excitedly about the next leg of their journey as they ambled off to drink themselves into oblivion. Sore and exhausted, Lorena finally clambered into the sunlight. She washed her face and hair in a basin she spotted in the captain's cabin, finally shedding the smell of onions, and briefly considered making off with the galleon. It would have been the sweetest revenge to do so, but deep down she knew that she was in no condition to sail a ship alone, particularly not one this size. Besides, she was incredibly thirsty. Leaving the vessel alone, she swaggered into the same tavern as her unwitting shipmates, smirked as the squat merchant did a double take that resolved itself into a suspicious glare, and ordered what would be the first of many drinks. She raised a glass, silently toasting her newfound freedom, and another, until the moon was high in the sky. By then the air was full of song, but Lorena did not hear it, for she was asleep before her head even struck the bench. "A tale worth every last rasher, as I'm any judge of them," said the barkeeper warmly, as Lorena finished her tale. "Truth be told, I've seen a few young whippersnappers like yourself turn up with a mysterious map in their hand, but you're the first I've ever heard of who made it as a stowaway. And no," he added, chuckling, as Lorena opened her mouth to interrupt, "I've no idea who wrote the note, but I'd like to thank 'em one of these days. They keep sending me customers." Lorena left her mouth open long enough to give a satisfied burp, then placed both her palms on the table as if to stand. "And what do these customers of yours do once they've sobered up?" she challenged. "This is a nice place to drink, but I don't want to be marooned here." Cheeks flushed with the heat of a large breakfast, the barkeeper lumbered to his feet and began to clear away the crockery. "Crewing up, mostly," he said after a moment's thought. "Least that's what they likes to call it. Finding people to sail with. Paying a visit to the shipwright for a vessel if they've got the gold." He tipped soapy water over the plates and began to scrub. "And you? Where might you be headed next?" "Oh, wherever the wind carries me," Lorena said airily. "Somewhere fresh." Truth be told, the question made her slightly uncomfortable, for her thoughts kept drifting back to the gold she didn't have. It had been a hearty breakfast, but she was well aware that her purse still needed filling as badly as her stomach had. Having bidden the barkeeper farewell, Lorena took a brisk walk around the island, though it yielded nothing of interest beyond the outpost, which was apparently named Sanctuary Outpost. Nothing at least until she spotted some laden banana plants high overhead, their fruit already beginning to drop and burst on the rocks below. Staring first at the splattered mess, and then at all the detritus the sea had washed up on the shore, Lorena saw the beginnings of a scheme. If she was successful, she hoped she'd make some coin and orchestrate an encounter with a crew willing to take her out on an adventure. Having gathered as many intact bananas as she could find, she selected the battered remains of a small rowboat that seemed to suit her purposes and began to dig it out of the sand, freeing it from the seaweed and other rubbish that had half buried it over the years. Dragging its husk back across the beach to a carefully scouted location at the dock was no mean feat, and while the other stall holders looked on intently, they made no attempt to assist her. By the time the rowboat was in place, upended to stand proudly on the sands, Lorena was rasping her tongue across dry lips, beads of sweat tumbling and getting in her eyes. Visions of grog swam through her mind, and she gazed longingly back up at the distant tavern. But she had a plan to complete. Next, she placed the bananas in what she hoped was an eye-catching arrangement. Though she'd be the first to admit she had no eye for aesthetics, and settled back to choose her first target. So it was that an elderly mariner who wanted nothing more than to limp his way up the hill for a grog or two found his path blocked by an imposing figure who thrust a piece of fruit under his nose and demanded, "Buy these bananas," with the tone of one committing a highway robbery. The mariner moved to protest, but Lorena scowled at him so fiercely that he soon found himself sat morosely outside the tavern, feeling altogether fuller, more sober, and less wealthy than he would have liked. In the distance, he could see Lorena hoisting her wares on yet more unsuspecting arrivals. While the coins felt welcome jingling in her pocket, Lorena was less interested in a career as a grocer than in using her prime vantage point to keep watch for suitable crews. Had she been back home, she might well have approached each docked vessel one by one and attempted to talk her way aboard. She was all too aware, however, that despite their crumpled clothing and blemished faces, these were pirates who sailed the Sea of Thieves on a daily basis and had experience she lacked. She had to be careful not to bite off more than she could chew, even if that was normally part of the fun. Instead, Lorena elected to bide her time, gauging the personalities and the proficiencies of the pirates that surrounded her, and making coin wherever she could. Sure enough, her patience was finally rewarded. She heard the two men before she saw them, their banter carrying down the hillside at a volume that meant she'd be hard-pressed to ignore them. Lorena was quiet by nature, preferring to let her actions speak for her, and the vivaciousness and volume of their quarrel nearly made her think twice about approaching them. "Ned, my friend, you know I speak only with the utmost respect and concern for your reputation, so I know that you will forgive me when I tell you again that this fool's errand will see us all drowned. You think we'll get our fair share from the gold hoarders? Ha! I say to you, ha!" One man scoffed. "It's good voyage, Faisal," the other responded. "It's better than yours anyway. Cargo runs always made a ship stink of pigs, and I'm the one who always has to slop out afterwards. You're just scared. We all have our talents, you know. Mine happens to be picking the jobs that will keep us all in one very wealthy piece. Your talents, on the other hand, are most certainly as varied as they are numerous. One day we may even discover what they are." The bickering duo stepped onto the boardwalk as they rounded the corner, providing Lorena with her first chance at a proper inspection. While they were obviously close friends, the two could hardly have been more mismatched. The one who appeared to be winning the verbal fencing match, presumably Faisal, was short and shaped like an egg. He possessed a great belly protruding over his belt that shook when he laughed, which was often. Most of his face was obscured by a curly beard that ran up the entire length of his face and framed twinkling, mischievous eyes. He might have been 5 years older than Lorena, or perhaps 15, the sort of man for whom grey hair and wrinkles will never have meaning. And he was dressed smartly in long trousers and an emerald shirt that struggled to contain him. The other, who had to be Ned, was a lumbering, craggy cliff of a man whom Lorena immediately decided was not to be pressured into buying fruit against his will, for he stood 2 full heads taller than she. He looked young, and his skin was fair, though he was already sweating in the heat of the day. He was, Lorena was forced to notice, completely hairless, save for his eyebrows, which were so blonde as to be almost invisible. He wore no shirt, possibly because no tailor had sufficient stamina to sew something in his size, or perhaps just so he could appear even more terrifying. The drawn blade in his right hand only added to his intimidating countenance. And Lorena took a deep breath before stepping out in front of them, making sure to keep out of swiping distance. "Gentlemen," she said, trying desperately to remember how to be personable after a day in the hot sun. "You appear to be at an impasse, but I can offer you a simple solution." Faisal's patter silenced immediately as Lorena addressed them, dark eyes gleaming as he slowly, nonchalantly laid one hand on the hilt of his sword. "I'd accuse you of eavesdropping, but I suppose we were hardly inconspicuous," he replied mildly, "and it would be ungracious of me to ignore free advice, even if we should choose not to follow it." "Good," Lorena said flatly. "Show me both of these voyages you're considering, and I'll decide which one we should sail on." She glanced at Ned, who seemed content to let Faisal handle proceedings, and arched an eyebrow expectantly. A flicker of recognition passed across Faisal's face, as if he knew the game he was being invited to play. "But, stranger, there is no impasse, you see, for we are a crew of 3. When the time comes to choose our next voyage, our captain shall break any deadlock. Your services are simply not required, I am sorry to say." They're short-handed, Lorena thought to herself. That could be a good thing, if I play my card right. She adopted a supercilious air and sniffed. "You choose to sail as a crew of merely 3, and you tell me I'm not needed? You should be sat with the rest of my wares." It took only a second before Faisal got the joke and grinned. "Aha! Because we must be bananas, yes? Ha ha! Very good. I think I like you. But even so..." There was a low rumble, and Ned said thoughtfully, "We're not supposed to be 3, though. Always had a crew of 4. Only we had to leave Kyrie behind." Lorena felt her lip curl, as she did not like the sound of that. "You left her behind? Why?" "We couldn't get the shog up the ladder." Lorena glared up at him, but Ned's face was impassive, and it was impossible to read any trace of insincerity in his expression. It was like trying to out-bluff a rock. "Kyrie," Faisal mused. Most regrettable indeed. And I suppose, now that you put me to it, we are somewhat underhanded. In more ways than one." He studied the bananas for a moment. "You're quite sure you're a good pirate? A strong pirate? You can handle yourself in a fight?" "If you want me to prove it," Lorena offered, "I could throw you into the sea." Ned twitched, but Faisal laid a placating hand on his arm. Breaking into a warm laugh, Lorena couldn't help but find endearing. "I think I must tell our captain all about you. If she agrees, we will be back for you and your bananas. In the meantime, you will need a weapon, and I am certain our friend Wilbur will have something within your means." Faisal's proclamation was accompanied by a grand gesture toward one of the larger buildings farther up the hill, where a faded sign depicting 2 crossed pistols was just about visible. "Shall we say an hour, then?" Lorena nodded her assent and watched them stroll away along the dock, before turning back to her makeshift stall. Whoever this Wilbur was, she hoped he didn't mind taking payment in fruit. It was then she noticed there was something sticking out of the rowboat's hull. Something that she was sure hadn't been there before. It was a knife, the blade of which had been stabbed through the molded planks halfway up to its hilt. When she moved to pull it out irritably, she saw the note it was pinning in place. "Seek Athena's fortune, Lorena. I mean it." Lorena's hand flew to her sword until she remembered she didn't have one, and a low growl of frustration escaped her throat as she forced herself not to tear off in search of the culprit. Whoever was following her was clearly angling to end their days as an oversized pincushion, but she wasn't about to let some cowardly prankster ruin her chances of joining a halfway competent crew. Gathering up the last of her bananas, she squared her shoulders and began to travel the long and winding path back to the outpost. Behind her, several scraps of viciously shredded paper were picked up by the wind and began their long journey out to sea.